Anarchism is not a romantic fable, but the hard-headed realization, based on 10,000 years of experience, that we cannot entrust the management of our lives to kings, priests, politicians, generals, and county commissioners. This is the Horizontal Power Hour, Anarchy on the Radio, your source for anti-authoritarian news, art, and comment, broadcast from WSU Middletown Community Radio. I'm Dan, here with Yale and Diego running the board. We have a really exciting show prepared for you today with a two-part presentation about anti-state resistance in Southeast Asia. Before we go any further, I'll remind you that the thoughts expressed on the Horizontal Power Hour are not necessarily those of WESU management, Wesleyan University, or the amalgamated students of Wesleyan University. The Horizontal Power Hour is an anti-authoritarian editorial collage featuring the views of the Dream Committee and the community at large.
Jim Scott, an expert on Southeast Asia and peasant resistance, was in town last week and gave a presentation based on the book, The Art of Not Being Governed, An Anarchist History of Upland Southeast Asia, which describes the historical efforts by the people of Zomia, a sort of transnational Appalachia or South Asian massif, to resist incorporation into valley-based state-building projects. And here we're about to play you part one.
My thesis is simple, suggestive, and controversial. Zomia is the largest remaining area of the world whose peoples have not yet been fully incorporated into nation states. Its days are numbered. Not so very long ago, however, such self-governing peoples were the great majority of mankind. They are today seen from the valley kingdoms as our living ancestors, what we were like before we discovered wet rice cultivation, Buddhism, and civilization. On the contrary, I argue that the hill peoples are best understood as runaway, fugitive communities who have, over the course of the last 2 millennia, have been fleeing oppressions of state-making projects in the valleys: slavery, conscription, taxes, corvée labor, epidemics, and warfare. Everything about these people's livelihoods, their social organization, their ideologies, and more controversially, even their illiteracy or their oral cultures, can be read as strategic choices designed to keep the state at arm's length. Their physical dispersion in rugged terrain, their mobility, their cropping practices that I'll be talking about, their kinship structure, their pliable ethnic identities, and even their devotion to prophetic millenarian leaders are designed to avoid incorporation into states and to preventing a state from arising among them. The huge literature on state-making, contemporary and historical, pays virtually no attention to its obverse, that is to say, the history of deliberate and reactive statelessness. This is the history of those who got away, and state-making can't be understood apart from it. This is also what makes it an anarchist history. This account potentially brings together the histories of all those people extruded by coercive state-making and unfree labor systems: gypsies, Cossacks, Inuit, polyglot tribes, and refugees from the Spanish Reducciones in the New World and the Philippines, fugitive slave communities, the Marsh Arabs, the Sand Bushmen, and so on. If we step way back and broaden the lens, and I mean really broaden the lens, Homo sapiens has been around for about 200,000 years. In Southeast Asia, Homo sapiens has been around about 50,000 years tops. Sedentary grain cultivation, invented something like 8,000 years ago, and small states in Southeast Asia arose no more than 3,000 years ago. So according to those things you sometimes see about, the last minute before midnight, in terms of the long history of Homo sapiens, states and sedentary agriculture are things that occur very late in the historical record. That is to say, Homo sapiens has lived most of its life historically outside the structure of states. The states that arose 3,000 years ago controlled a minuscule portion of the globe. Everything outside their scope was considered fiscally sterile. That is to say, the zone of a dispersed people and dispersed production, there was no easy way in which the resources of this zone could be successfully accessed. This huge area was seen as a barbarian periphery for these early states, whether the early state was the Chandragupta states of India, the early Han dynasties, or for that matter, Rome. The valleys, historically, have been the location for states, for social hierarchy, for taxes, for kings and a permanent clergy, for large-scale war, for self-described civilization, and this is particularly important, wet rice cultivation. The hills, on the contrary, have been the location for swidden or slash and burn cultivation, shifting cultivation. The area of no permanent states, they're episodic states, but they tend to break down easily. It's a zone of population dispersal rather than concentration. It's relatively egalitarian. It's not absolutely egalitarian by any means, but it's relatively egalitarian vis-a-vis the lowland. It is a zone of tremendous linguistic and cultural variety, unlike the valley. And it's an area in which no taxes are provided for permanent king or clergy. The fact that as many people until the 19th century went to the hills as came back from the hills, this is not recognized because it doesn't fit in with this civilizational narrative. Why, after all, would people go over to the barbarians? Owen Lattimore reminded us a long time ago that the Great Walls of China were built just as much to keep the Chinese in as to keep the barbarians out. Brodel writes, "The mountains are, as a rule, a world apart from civilization, which are an urban and lowland achievement. Their history, that is to say the history of the mountains, is to have none. To remain, the people without history, to remain always on the fringes of the great waves of civilization, even the longest and most persistent, which may spread over great distances in a horizontal plane, but are powerless to move vertically when faced with an obstacle of several hundred meters." This is why the talk that I'm giving I sometimes call Why Civilizations Can't Climb Hills. My argument, however, is not so much that civilizations can't climb hills, but rather that people climb hills in order to get away from civilizations, or more precisely, to get away from states. If it was your job to invent a kind of agriculture for this kingdom, you would invent something very much like wet rice agriculture. The advantages of wet rice agriculture are enormous. It is the most concentrated form of caloric production in the pre-modern world, in Asia. If the tax collector wants your rice, they just have to come when it's ripe, and they can take it all. Or they can wait till you put it in the granary, and they can make the job even easier by simply emptying your granary and taking away the grain. Or if they hate you, they can simply burn the crop when it's drying in the fields, and you're finished. You have to move on. Your entire food supply has been destroyed. Before I say more about questions like literacy and so on, let me say something about the kind of agriculture that you find in the hills. As I said, shifting agriculture, slash and burn agriculture, fire field agriculture, or swiddening it's sometimes called. And let's imagine that you were an anti-Colbert, and your job as a strategist was to design a form of agriculture that would be most successful in evading state appropriation. What kind of agriculture would you design? I think you would fall in love with the root crops. Taro, yam, sweet potato, potatoes, and my nominee for champion escape crop of the world would be cassava or manioc or yucca. And I'll give you an example of its escape characteristics. You can plant cassava almost any time, almost anywhere actually. It grows with relatively little care. It's easy to disguise. It ripens in less than a year, but it can be, and this is crucial, it can be safely left in the ground for another 2 years and still be fine to eat. You can dig it up and eat it. If the state wants your cassava, it has to dig it up tuber by tuber, and then it has a cartload of tubers, which is not very valuable and can't be transported very far. By the way, this point of the understanding that root crops allow a population to survive predations was something that Friedrich the Great learned at the siege of Philipsburg, because the people of Philipsburg resisted a siege for a long time because Frederick the Great told himself they grew potatoes. So after the armies passed by during the daytime, they'd come back at night, dig up enough for the evening meal, and they could survive. They could stay in that area. And Friedrich the Great then forced the Prussian population to plant potatoes because he knew they would be able to remain there as a military conscriptable population, even though armies went back and forth across Prussia. In Southeast Asia, maize, corn, was also early on an escape crop. The Portuguese bring maize in the 16th century, and within 80 years it spread over much of Southeast Asia. What's interesting is that it spreads to that area above 1,500 meters where hill rice will no longer grow. That is to say, the great advantage of maize is that it allows people to move further up the watershed, further from state centers, and still have a major grain that they can plant. And it was adapted largely for that reason. Swiddening in general is a kind of agriculture that a state finds it nearly impossible to control and to appropriate the products of. A typical shifting cultivation field is growing sometimes 20, sometimes 30, 40 different cultivars. They mature at different times during the year. The fields themselves, every 2 or 3 or 4 years, are shifted to another area that is burned, and often the population shifts with it. So you have a shifting population. You have shifting fields that cannot be made easily the object of a cadastral survey for taxes. People themselves are fugitive, and the crops are so diverse and of different maturities that if the tax man comes at any one time, there's only going to be 1 or 2 things that are ripe that could be seized in the first place. And in the hills, providing they're not extremely steep mountainsides, in the hills it's almost always possible to plant wet rice in the depressions or by building terraces. You can do swiddening agriculture, or you can do foraging and hunting. And we know for large areas of Southeast Asia, even in the 20th century in the hills, that people have shifted between one form of subsistence to another depending on the pressure exerted on them by the state. That is to say, they're likely to plant wet rice to settle in more dense numbers and have permanent fields. As state pressure of one kind or another increases, they're likely to increase their swiddening and shifting cultivation, and if the pressure gets particularly threatening, they will resort to foraging. This is essentially why I mentioned Pierre Clastres. The reason Pierre Clastres is an inspiration to me is that he understood that in South America, that the Siriono, the Yanomamo, the Guarani, people who were seen as Stone Age survivals, as people who had kind of never had the wit to invent sedentary cultivation, he understood that these were ex-sedentary cultivators who ran away from the Spanish reducciones because of the diseases and forced labor, and went to foraging because it was a way of remaining at a distance from the state, and that they developed a social structure that would prevent large chiefs from arising among them. So in that sense, Pierre Clastres was the first to realize that people who looked like backward primitives still living in kind of a Stone Age economy were in fact a runaway community from state-making projects, in his particular case, the Spanish reducciones. I've described a kind of escape agriculture. I think I could describe a kind of escape social structure as well, in which groups in highland Southeast Asia are able to fission and divide and disperse whenever they feel threatened. Villages often fission in this way when they're having bad luck anyway. The process of fissioning is a process in which they can either have a kind of maximal lineage, a fragment of a lineage, and sometimes even individuals, nuclear families, and so on, depending on the kind of pressure that they are under. And this form of fissioning was described for the Berbers by Ernest Gellner, and he said that it was as if the Berbers had a proverb of their own, which was divide that ye be not ruled. A kind of nice play on words for divide and rule. The idea that if you split into much smaller groups and dispersed across the landscape, you could not be made the object of state appropriation and state capture. So let me say something about the most controversial chapter of my book. My argument, as you see, is that many of the characteristics for which these people are seen as primitive and barbarians are characteristics that have a tremendous political value at placing themselves at a distance from the state. So here's the question with respect to literacy and oral culture. Almost all of the people, something that one encounters again and again and again, and also in maritime Southeast Asia as well, many of the hill peoples have a story about how they once had writing, they once had books, and they lost them. Sometimes it's a question of treachery, someone took the book. Sometimes it's a question of carelessness, wrote the letters on a hide and it burned up when their Sweden burned, and so on. What's interesting is the near universality of these stories saying we once had books, we once had kings often, we once grew wet rice, and we once had texts. We know that two large groups that are in the hills today, the Miao or Hmong, many of whom come to the U.S. after the Cold War, or the Mien or Yao, we know that 1,000 years ago, these were people who were in the lower Yangtze Valley. And gradually, many of them just became Han, of course, but those who didn't become Han retreated up the Yangtze River, also up the sort of Pearl River, and ended finally in the hills of Southeast Asia. It's certain, virtually certain, that these people 1,000 years ago, living in the valleys, had access to Chinese texts, to forms of literacy, and to books. And so it seems to me that it might be plausible to suggest that as they moved, as they found themselves moving in a kind of history, an itinerary that took them past many different states and so on, they found it more convenient to have an oral culture for the following reason, that oral cultures are far more plastic. They remain traditional, although they are shifting all of the time, right? Because there is no written text that you can measure the deviation from. The written text survives the conditions of its production, and you can always say, well, you're not saying it right because this is the or text, this is the original text that we have in a written form, and we've accepted this as orthodoxy. So orthodoxy is impossible unless you have a kind of written text from which you can measure deviations. You can, if you want, preserve orally things almost word perfect, but it depends on the community accepting this as word perfect. My argument is that we at least ought to consider the possibility that it made sense for lots of wandering, weak people in the hills to be able to adjust their itinerary, their genealogy, where they came from, who they were, and so on, and their stories and narratives to the powerful peoples among whom they were moving over time. And they found it therefore more convenient to have an oral culture and less convenient to have a written culture. It's also worth adding that for most people historically, the creation of written documents is a technology of the state. What are, after all, the first written documents in Babylonia? These are written documents that are lists of taxes, lists of kind of land holdings, lists of dues, lists of population rolls, and so on. So in very, very early peasant rebellions, one of the first acts of peasant rebels is to actually burn the records office with the idea that it is this paper, it is this writing that is an artifact of the state and a technology of the state. So you have then both the kind of advantages or orality, I prefer not to call it illiteracy because it's another kind of history and narrative and a way of keeping records. But there may be strategic advantages in orality as opposed to written texts. And the association of written texts with state technologies. There are historical parallels for this. So in what is known as the Greek Dark Ages, so in roughly 1100 BC, the Greeks are literate in Linear B. And then from 1100 to 700, this period called the Dark Ages. I don't know why Dark Ages, because the Iliad and the Odyssey come from exactly this period. In 700, they become literate again. But they become literate by borrowing the Phoenician alphabet, the progenitor of sort of modern Greek. And so here's a period of 400 years where literacy is lost. It's a time of disorder. It's often seen as a period of invasion of the Peloponnesus. The historical record is contested. But in any case, a lot of the centers of cities were destroyed and so on, and literacy disappeared for this period of 400 years. And when it reappeared, it appeared in a completely different form. The other example, of course, is the periphery of the Roman Empire, Gallo-Roman Empire, after the 4th century AD, when the Roman Empire collapses. Literacy disappears. There's no longer, except for a few monasteries, there is no longer the kind of offices and kind of Roman titles that are available. There's not the structure that would make literacy a kind of valuable prestige good and a kind of career. And so for actually several centuries, literacy disappears except as a kind of monastic, what would you call it, a monastic kind of museumship of a kind in religious texts. So I don't have any evidence that this Just So story about orality is true. But it seems to kind of fit with the other things for which we have much more striking evidence of in social structure, in agricultural techniques, in physical dispersal, and so on, in which the shifts in social structure, shifts in agriculture, and so on, are finely tuned to reflect relationship to states, and in difficult times, people move in a certain direction, and difficult certain times they move back. And the story of literacy and orality seems plausibly to fit with that, and is, I think, a kind of worthy object of more study than I'm able to give to it. So let me finish. I should add that there are lots of peoples in the hills who actually don't actually have a genealogy. They don't have a story of their origins and so on. They are as if they choose to be a people with a minimal history and a minimal genealogical depth. And you can see how that gives them a greater room for maneuver. They're not tied to a particular history and kind of narrative of where they came from and where they're headed. And I would argue that perhaps if these people are without a history, it's because, or maybe because, they choose not to have a history. That is, or you could say they have just as much history as they want and no more. Finally, it's worth noting that virtually all their characteristics, those that mark them out as primitives or barbarians, that is to say, their physical dispersal, their simplified social organization, the fact that they have no permanent rulers, the fact that they practice shifting cultivation rather than sedentary civilized cultivation, the fact that they don't have books and letters, and that they live in remote, inaccessible places, and that they generally, until very recently, have not followed lowland religions. That all of these characteristics are best understood, I would argue, as strategic adaptations, as a political positioning vis-a-vis states, as an effort to keep the states at arm's length, and not as some primordial condition that they have somehow not been able to escape.
This is the Horizontal Power Hour, Anarchy on the Radio, your source for anti-authoritarian news, art, and comment, broadcast from WSU Middletown Community Radio.